You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
An all-new season of The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives is now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
Mom talk has just been blowing up.
Whitney and Jen are on Dancing with the Stars.
Taylor is a bachelorette.
Saying that out loud is crazy. That is huge.
But all the cool opportunities could pull us apart.
It's causing issues in everyone's marriage.
My whole world is falling apart right now. It's chaos.
Watch the Hulu original series, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney Plus for bundle subscribers. Terms apply.
We all want to know, what makes people tick?
How will they make decisions?
Handle feedback?
And work
as a team.
The Predictive Index Behavioral Assessment reveals how employees actually think, work, and thrive. Like how Marcus fits in a role with structure, and Margot's strength is collaborating with others. Because when we understand each other, work just works. Take the behavioral assessment today at try.predictiveindex.com.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 251, Greece Part 3, The Path to Escalation. This week, a big thank you goes out to Meeks, Jay, and Gavin for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. The popular history of the early years of the Second World War is generally structured based on where Germany was placing its attention at any given moment. To a certain extent, this is completely understandable, as they were generally the country that was driving events through aggressive military action. But as we have discussed, the story of the war in Greece began months before they were involved at all, but it would greatly expand in scope once the Germans and the British joined in the fighting between the Italians and the Greeks. The British would be more proactive in their approach to the fighting in Greece, making it clear from the very beginning that they were willing to help the Greeks in any way that they could. But on the Greek side, there was hesitancy to accept this assistance due to concern that it would just cause escalation. Metaxas and the other Greek leaders were confident that they could handle the Italians on their own. They just needed equipment and supplies. Therefore, bringing in large numbers of British forces would only serve to risk German involvement. And in late 1940, the Germans were on over a year of shocking military successes, so keeping them out of the fighting seemed like the best course of action for the Greeks. Of course, both the British and the Germans would become involved in the fighting on the ground in Greece, and this episode will discuss how that happened. For the Germans, they would do so to prepare and protect future operations. For the British, they were kind of just trying to find anywhere that they could fight back against the Italians and the Germans, and Greece seemed like a good enough place. When discussing how the Germans became involved, there is an important distinction between the conversations that they had with the Italians and the actual German plans behind the scenes. They did not tell the Italian leaders everything, and what was made clear after the war, when their own internal documents were analyzed, is that there were plans for intervention in the Balkans and Greece months before they actually committed to them with the Italians. Part of this was just normal military planning, with, for example, the OKH and OKW, the German rough analogs of the General Staff and the War Ministry, having spent time on planning for such operations during the spring of 1940, just in case they needed them. Some of this planning was driven by the fact that some German leaders felt that if they did not help the Italians, there was a risk that Mussolini's government would become unstable due to military failure. And while the Italians would not have the military strength of Germany, they were still very useful, particularly when it came to engaging British forces in the Mediterranean and North Africa. As the Chief of Staff Halder would say, quote, "We must not risk the internal collapse of Italy. Italy must be saved from that. It will be necessary to send some help." End quote. While there was some concern about the internal stability of Italy, as mentioned in previous episodes, the main driver behind German involvement was the possibility of British bombers hitting the Romanian oil fields. This threat would become much more pronounced when the British took over control of Crete from the Greek government. Crete was an important island to control and provided the British with a base of operations in the eastern Mediterranean for both air and naval forces. It would also, theoretically, bring British bombers within range of Romania. The Germans heavily depended on Romanian oil, and therefore the defense of this area was critical to the German war effort, especially when they were already planning to invade the Soviet Union, where Germany got most of its oil from. So non-Russian sources of oil were very, very important. What the Germans could not know is that Metaxas had only allowed the British forces to base forces on Crete with the agreement that they would not use those bases for raids on Romania, which was another decision made in the hopes of keeping Germany out of the fighting. It didn't really work, and as the British commitment of RAF resources continued to grow in Greece, the Germans started to get serious about how they could assist the Italians in their invasion. This planning really got going in early November 1940 and would be expanded and refined in the months that followed. This was also the same time that the plans for Barbarossa were being formulated, so there was a lot of planning work happening during this time. The eventual name for the plan would be Operation Marita, and the general idea was that it would be launched early in the spring of 1941 so that it could be completed before the invasion of the Soviet Union was initiated. The expectation was that the entire invasion could be completed in 3 weeks, which meant that if it started in March, there would be plenty of time for troops to be committed, complete their objectives, and then withdrawn and reorganized before Barbarossa for those forces that also needed to participate in the invasion of the Soviet Union. But there was a problem that the Germans would have to solve if they wanted to invade Greece. They had to get to Greece. At the time the planning started, the German military did not have any bases or any access to the Greek border, and so troops began to move late in 1940 to provide that access and to do other things. For example, German units would move into Romania, ostensibly to train and equip the Romanian forces as part of an agreement to assist with their training. The actual reason was threefold: to generally protect German interests within the country, to ensure that oil would keep flowing, to prepare for the invasion of the Soviet Union, which Romania would be used as one of the sort of staging points for that invasion, and also to extend German control further into the Balkans toward Greece for their upcoming invasion of Greece. Discussions would also occur with Bulgaria to ensure that German forces could move through the country, and also to invite Bulgaria to join in the attack on Greece itself. The final important piece of the puzzle was gaining the ability to move military forces and supplies through Yugoslavia, which was a whole story in and of itself, which we covered back in episode 245 and 246 of the podcast. Yugoslavia was critical just because of its placement on the map. It was the easiest and best way for the Germans to move the required forces south in preparation for the invasion. All of these efforts would be completed by March 1941, although the Yugoslavia situation would require far more military force than expected. These diplomatic moves could not remain completely secret, and the British and the Greeks would learn about them from a variety of different sources. Enigma intercepts were an important source for the British, particularly from Luftwaffe communications, which were sent from Romania during December 1940. The Luftwaffe Enigma system was far easier than the German Navy codes for the British to crack, and so they were a good source of information in late 1940, and they would use it in this instance. There would also be some intelligence that would be communicated from within Poland, with information about the transport of German equipment being an important piece of that. But all this merely confirmed British suspicions about future German actions, and in fact, the British efforts to bolster the Greek defenses were, by February 1941, already well underway.
Don't chew on that, Max.
Cooper loves that chew, too.
Oh, now he's into Cooper's food. Wow, he is loving it. What do you feed Cooper?
Blue Buffalo Life Protection Formula. He never leaves a crumb. I love it because it's made with high-quality protein, nutrient-rich fruits and veggies, and wholesome whole grains.
Looks like we're switching to Blue.
Blue Buffalo foods are made with the superior ingredients your dog needs to thrive. Can your dog food say that? Visit feedbluefood.com to learn more.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
While the Germans had elected to join with Italy in their Greek campaign, To protect vital resources and their future operations, the British would send help to Greece to try and stretch Italian and German resources thin around the continent. From the very beginning of the war in September 1939, France and Britain had been interested in expanding the war in the Balkans, primarily due to the hope that focusing Germany somewhere, anywhere but France, would allow them to sort of buy some time before an invasion of France would occur. Obviously, they would not accomplish this before the fall of France in June 1940, but that did not dampen British interest in supporting any country anywhere that might join them in the fight against their enemies. This included Greece. And as soon as the Italian attack into Greece began in October 1940, Churchill was adamant that help should be sent immediately. The first major help to arrive were units of the RAF, with the first squadrons landing on airfields near Athens on November 3rd. The initial number of aircraft committed to the effort was small, just a handful of Blenheim bombers and Gloucester Gladiator fighters, but more were promised. And anything that arrived were important for the Greeks, and the British would quickly begin launching attacks on Italian shipping using these aircraft. The RAF aircraft were of course the easiest to move to Greece. They could just fly there. But as soon as Metaxas initially asked for help from the British, far larger plans began to take shape in London about what the long-term plans could be for sending aid and support to the Greeks. Churchill was very clear that he considered it absolutely essential that Greece was kept in the war. It would accomplish three important goals. The first was that it would distract the Italians from North Africa. It was also likely to force the Germans to commit resources at a time when it was unclear what the next step for the German military would be. And finally, it was simply seen as a great way to boost morale. If the British could show that they could support Greece and keep it in the war and keep it fighting, then other small countries around Europe might be enticed to also enter into the conflict. Every single nation that did would, theoretically, drain away German resources, while the British and their allies grew stronger. These were all great goals, but they presented some major challenges for the British in late 1940. The most important was that, due to the fighting in North Africa, the frantic buildups in other areas of the empire, and just the general state of the British military forces in the months after the Battle of Britain, they were ill-prepared to send real assistance to Greece. Sure, they could send some token forces, a few squadrons of aircraft here and there, but what Greece would need would not just be a few aircraft, but massive amounts of supplies and equipment, and maybe, possibly, soldiers. Those three things were also what the British forces desperately needed at this point in the war. This did not deter Churchill, though, and the other supporters of sending aid to Greece. They were focused more on the long-term benefits instead of the short-term challenges. One of the first ways in which the British became involved in events in Greece was by entering into discussions with the Greek government about Crete. Crete was an island in the eastern Mediterranean, which was seen as an important naval and air base for the British, and they certainly did not want the Italians or Germans taking control of it. To try and solve two issues with one solution, the British offered to take over defense of the island. In exchange, the Royal Navy would be allowed to establish a naval base in Suda Bay on Crete. For the Greek government, this was seen as a major positive development because not only did it bring the Royal Navy closer to Greece, which would allow it to better guard and secure Greece's maritime supply lines, it would also allow the Cretan 5th Division of the Greek army to be transported off of Crete and onto the mainland. This was a time when every division was valuable for the Greek army, and so not having one tied down in defense of an island that was already at low risk was seen as a real improvement. While the discussions around Crete were being had, there were also several different discussions happening on the British side between naval, aviation, and army leaders in the Mediterranean. They all had somewhat different opinions on the Greek situation, on how their service could assist in the campaign. For his part, Admiral Cunningham of the Royal Navy had no real concerns about his ability to protect convoys in and out of Greece, with the one caveat being that he would need the Royal Air Force to at least reduce the ability of the enemy to launch air attacks on those convoys and the Royal Navy ships. Air Marshal Longmore, although he had initially been quite optimistic about the Greek adventure, now began to have some concerns that he would not be able to stage the resources into Greece that would be required if he was going to have to deal with the Luftwaffe. The Italian Air Force, different story, but the Luftwaffe would be a major challenge. When it came to ground forces, General Wavell was hesitant to commit them because it meant robbing men and supplies from the campaign in North Africa, which in the aftermath of Operation Compass was the one point on the globe where the British military seemed close to any kind of success. But they all knew that they were expected to support Greece. That came from the highest levels in London, and so they would. One important discussion that was had, and it would turn out to be very prophetic, was that all of the commanders involved agreed that if the worst happened and the British forces needed to be evacuated, that could be accomplished. That came down to the Royal Navy, and they were confident in the Royal Navy more than they were confident in anything. And this was really good because, a bit of a spoiler here, they're going to need to evacuate a lot of troops. While the military conversations were occurring, both private and eventually with the Greeks, there were also another line of discussions that would occur between the British and other countries in the Balkans and then around Greece. The leader of these discussions would be Anthony Eden, who was the Secretary of State for War at this point in the conflict. But more importantly, he was very, very close to Churchill. Eden's big idea was for the creation of a Balkan alliance, which would function as a bulwark against the advance of fascism into the Balkans, with Greece, Turkey, and Yugoslavia being key members. They would, of course, be supported by the British, and I'm not going to say that this was a bad idea, but it had been tried before. It had been a topic of conversation after the First World War. The French had tried to bring things together. The countries in the Balkans had tried during the early 1930s. But there were just too many issues. By the time that Eden got really involved, it was basically just too late. The number of challenges to overcome was simply too large. The Yugoslav and Turkish military forces were even weaker than the Greek forces. It was difficult to get a commitment from each nation to join a war with Germany, who was on a string, again, of tremendous victories at this point. And you were trying to get them to enter a war with this war machine just for the sake of another nation. Eventually realizing that such a grand alliance was impossible, Eden would then transition into the role of a British representative in Greece that made great promises, and ones that often simply could not be delivered on by the British government and the British military. He would promise more ground forces than could be provided, and on timelines that could not be met. And all along there were attempts to bring Turkey into the war against Germany and Italy, which would end up being completely unsuccessful, and the country would not join the Allies until February 1945. Even though all of these negotiations and conversations would lead to nothing, I think they are important because it shows how large the goals were for British foreign policy and how far they were from achieving those goals. 1941 would not be a good year for the British military, but it was just as bad for British foreign policy, except for the entry of the Soviet Union into the war and relations with the United States. And the British had only kind of a little bit to do with either of those things. That was mostly just Germany doing things and the British benefiting. Discussions between the Greek government and representatives from London would continue throughout the last months of 1940 and into 1941. One of the key beliefs on the Greek side was that they believed that they could deal with the Italians, a belief that had been reinforced by the early fighting and the quick defeat of the initial Italian offensive. This would make Metaxas and other Greek leaders hesitant to go all in on getting British support, due to fears that it would just be an escalation that would make German involvement inevitable. But at the same time, they knew they would need British help if German forces did become involved, and so all of the conversations until Metaxas' death would be something of a balancing act for the Greek leaders. While these conversations were ongoing, further RAF units arrived in mid-December, including another squadron of Blenheims and a squadron of Hurricanes. Much like the previous aircraft, these would take up positions around Athens, with the goal of both attacking Italian shipping while also helping to defend the Greek cities from Italian bombers. During early June, the British would learn through decryption of Luftwaffe Enigma traffic that Luftwaffe personnel were being moved into Romania, which seemed like a clear sign that the Germans were planning to do something in the region. The most pessimistic of British predictions would state that the Germans were set to attack Greece later in January. These predictions would not come true, but it would prompt further action from the British leaders, and the commander of the Middle Eastern Theater, General Wavell, and his head of RAF Resources, Air Chief Marshal Longmore, would go to Athens in mid-January to meet with Greek leaders directly. Wavell would offer to send British ground forces to Greece, although their number would be somewhat limited to a single tank regiment and some anti-aircraft, anti-tank, and artillery units. This was seen by the Greeks both as too much of a commitment and also not enough. It was enough of a commitment, really any ground forces were, or their fears were, to give the Germans an excuse to get involved, but it was too small of a force to actually provide any real protection or deterrence from a German attack. This introduced the core disagreement between the two sides at this point in the timeline. Wavell and the British wanted to send ground forces to Greece to ensure that they stayed in the war and that they kept fighting. They were concerned that if all they did was send the Greeks supplies, equipment, and some aircraft, it was possible that they would work out a separate peace with Italy, which, to be fair, would have been the best possible course for both Italy and Greece at this point in the war, so it's hard to blame the British for this concern. All that the Greeks really wanted at this point were supplies, equipment, and RAF fighters to protect Greek cities, particularly if the British ground forces were going to be relatively small, like what was being offered. The Greek fear was that the British were trying to use them to start a proxy war with Germany, using Greek forces instead of British forces against the Germans. The matter would just kind of sit unresolved throughout the rest of January 1941, until Metaxas' death on January 29th, which brought about a major change in the Greek mindset. Metaxas had been one of the leading voices behind the fear of British involvement resulting in German involvement. He had firm faith that the Greek forces could, by themselves, beat the Italians, and therefore he wanted to ensure that British involvement did not cause escalation. What he could not have known is that the decision had already been made by the Germans in January 1941 to get involved in both North Africa and in Greece, and so the British involvement would not have changed anything. But after his death, his replacement as Prime Minister would be far more keen to get as much British support as possible as quickly as possible. On February 9th, a message was sent to the British that the Greeks wanted to once again begin discussions about what support could be provided. Conversations would continue in the weeks that followed, and as evidence of a German military buildup in Romania continued to increase, and concerns grew about German conversations with Bulgaria, the Greek leaders did begin to see British ground forces as not just a possibility, but perhaps a necessity. However, they were very clear that they wanted a major commitment. The commander-in-chief of the Greek army, Alexander Papagos, would say that he wanted at least 9 British divisions, with the idea being that those 9, plus the 4 Greek divisions that were positioned to meet a possible German attack, would be enough to give them a fighting chance. Really, 10 divisions would be better, or even more, but 9. They'll settle for 9. The problem was, in early 1941, the British did not have 9 divisions really in the entire Mediterranean, let alone 9 divisions that they could send to Greece. It would have almost equaled the size of the British Expeditionary Force that had been sent to France by the time the Germans invaded in May 1940. This was just not going to happen. It should also be said that it's very likely that the Greek military leaders who were drawing up these requirements knew that the size of the force that they were asking for was not something that the British could provide. Whether that was just some kind of continued belief in Metaxas' judgment from before his death, or just trying to make sure the British understood the needs of the Greek military, it's hard to know. Instead, Wavell would say that they could send 2, maybe 3 divisions, and even those would not be available until late March. This timeline was generally driven by the fact that forces from the Empire were arriving in Egypt, and it was only after more forces arrived that troops could then be sent to Greece. While the Greeks were not happy with such a small number of divisions, they would eventually agree to receive 3 British divisions plus an armored brigade. It was better than nothing, I guess, although as German troops entered Bulgaria in early March, the question became, would they even arrive in time to be of assistance when the German attack might begin? As the British began to plan for the arrival of their troops, it very quickly became clear that there were disagreements on the two sides about the best way to structure the defense of Greece. The British wanted the Greeks to give up the sliver of Albania that they had captured and retreat further south, while still maintaining their defense of Macedonia and Thrace. The Greeks wanted to do the exact opposite, giving up pieces of Macedonia and Thrace to focus on other areas, including that sliver of Albania. This disagreement was rooted in a core difference of opinion when it came to what the goal was of the fighting in Greece. Both the British and the Greeks wanted to defend Greece from an Italian and German invasion. But the British also saw it as a way to bring Yugoslavia and Turkey into the war on their side. This caused their defensive plans to be structured in a way to try and allow to make this happen. That's why the British initially wanted to hold on to Thrace. That was the bridge to Turkey that they wanted to hold on to. It should also be said very clearly that the British did not know exactly what they were getting into or what the best defensive strategy was. Partially, they were just guessing. Partially, they just believed that they somehow knew better than the Greeks about what the best path forward was. It was a bit arrogant, really. Next episode, we will focus in more detail on some of these disagreements, along with the last fighting on the Albanian front in the spring of 1941, and then the state of British and Greek forces before the beginning of the German attack.